Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. This was the first match against my fourth opponent in my group in round one of the lower rated Aussies 2021 Christmas Challenge tournament. My opponent played with the white pieces and used the London system, which is an opening to which I have relatively little familiarity. This resulted in an interesting and aggressive game by my opponent, which ultimately turned out in my favour. Please enjoy! So let's have a quick look at a review of this game. So this is chess.com's algorithm. So I think I played quite well in this game with almost a 90% accuracy. However, as you can see, I was gradually drifting towards, losing in the opening. And then after a blunder by my opponent, I managed to hold on to the advantage to victory. Let's move on to the analysis now. Rightio, and so in this game, my opponent played with the white pieces and I black, and they started with the queen's pawn, d4. I responded with d5, and they next developed bishop f4, so the accelerated London system. Now, against the accelerated London, I don't have any particular strong response other than just general principles, trying to control the center, develop pawns, develop my minor pieces, try to castle. So knight f6, e3, bishop f5, knight f3, and now my other knight c6. Opponent develops their other knight c3, and lastly I play e6. And I note that Stockfish reckons prior to that move immediately attacking the bishop on f4 was good. So that's something I think I'll just have to remember. Opponent plays bishop e2. I play bishop d6, and at the moment after the opening, we are both basically dead equal. Now the opponent sort of retreats their bishop to g3. So rather than taking, here I opted to keep the tension, to bring an extra attacker in a form of knight e4, expecting that we'll probably have a series of trades, and that's what happens. And I note that this actually advantages my opponent. Plus 0.57. So definitely not critical, but that wasn't the best move in this line. Opponent plays c3, and I decide to sort of whack that bishop. Again, that was not the best move for me here, Stockfish preferring h5. I thought this was potentially okay for me, given that I damaged the opponent's structure, though at a certain level, if I'm planning on castling kingside, I have opened up the h file for the opponent rook, so that may not actually be advantageous to me. I play f6, and my logic here was to sort of restrain the mobility of the opponent's knight. Opponent plays d3, so I suppose potentially sort of threatening my bishop. Here I decided to play queen e7, and my goal here I think was to potentially castle queenside, given that would probably not. So during this part of the game, I was thinking that probably wouldn't be a good direction to castle. Opponent captures bishop. With bishop, I capture back with pawn. I thought that this was still possibly okay for me, even though I have potentially sort of damaged some of the structure of my pawns. Opponent brings their knight back to d2. And here, for some reason, I was so focused on long castles, I simply just missed the fact that this pawn on e4 was hanging. The most obvious move here, of course, is just to play f5. However, I didn't, and the opponent immediately captures that hanging pawn. I play now b6, so thinking that it would probably be a good idea to sort of evacuate my king to that square. Opponent plays queen d3, so starting to bring some attackers onto the king side. So I'm feeling a little bit sort of uncomfortable here, and seemingly rightly so, with sort of stockfish evaluation definitely drifting towards my opponent. I put king on b7, so that seems still to be a reasonable move. Opponent now starting a kingside push with b4, and I knew here I was in some trouble. So I play knight e5 with sort of an attack on the queen. Now, clearly that cannot immediately be taken by pawn, given that it's pinned to the queen. So I thought that was potentially a reasonably good move. Opponent takes queen back to e2, which is a good move, but of course now my knight is potentially hanging. So I decided to address that by attacking the opponent's knight with my pawn as well. And interestingly enough, so the opponent sort of, I suppose, continues to bring on the tension by playing rook d1. I now move my knight out of the way, so knight c6, again with an extra defender on that rook, and that knight, of course, is still hanging. And here, my opponent, I think, makes an aggressive blunder. So, trying to sort of play sort of a kingside pawn storm, which it's sort of a good idea. Trying to bring the attackers to the king, but of course that knight is hanging, and otherwise at the moment we practically have almost material balance. There's sort of one pawn up. That was the pawn I sort of hung before. So I sort of looked at this for a while, and I couldn't see any reason why I shouldn't just straight up capture that knight. So I did. And pretty much from this point onwards, I have quite a substantial advantage over my opponent. And I sort of calculated how big a problem these pawns advancing forward were. No, it is. It's not a. It's something that needs to be played carefully. But from my calculation, I thought I was probably actually okay, and that's, I think, what's turned out. So a5, which is good. Rather than sort of capturing straight out, of course, I've got the queen sort of along this diagonal. I just played a6, captures. That's okay. Can capture back. These two pawns are still defended, and also the knight defended by the king. Bringing the rook over, that's okay. I bring my rook over as an extra defender. Obviously, have to be careful. Be careful with that. Bringing forward b5. That is quite a reasonable move. But I can just capture straight here. I can capture straight here. I can accept. I can accept the potential loss of that pawn, but no, they do need to do something here, because otherwise I capture here with check, and basically that would lead to a loss of 2 rooks. So basically a forced move here that the opponent has to capture my rook. But again, I'm okay with this. I'm materially ahead. So I welcome potentially a trade in pieces to basically neuter my opponent's attack. So here they opted not to capture, opted to bring, I suppose, the other rook into the party. But here I straight up just captured. So there was no reason for me not to capture. They're forced to capture back, and here I can force another trade. So capture captures. That pawn was always lost. Bring the king back to b7, and now the opponent does have more pawns. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versus 4. But I've got the extra knight, and that must count for something. Stockfish still thinks 3.5 in my favor. Opponent brings their queen across, having an attack on my pawns makes a lot of sense. However, that's relatively easily defended. So that pawn's defended by my queen, and of course there's a direct attack. So opponent must respond, by moving their queen somewhere. And here I think they made another mistake. So I am happy again to trade pieces. In fact, that is their most aggressive. No, that's their sort of most active piece. If I trade that, I still have a knight, and I was thinking with an extra knight, 4 versus 6 pawns, I should win. I should, I have to play carefully, but I should win. So captures, captures, and yeah, definitely according to Stockfish, I am winning. Though of course, I still have to convert. So first thing I do, stop the advance of that H pawn. Opponent needs to move their king. Now, obviously, they need to use their king if they have any hope of pushing their pawns forward to promotion. From what I could tell, this was a very important pawn for me on the B file, because if I whacked that pawn on the C file, this basically becomes a passed pawn, and all these other pawns potentially can be defended by my existing pawns. So push the pawn forward to B5. King moves forward again. However, from what I could tell, the king has actually some challenges with movement. So can't move to the square, cannot move to the square, potentially can move to this square. So what I decided to do next was to bring my knight to e7 with the idea that I would try to take out that c3 pawn. Opponent brings their king forward as I expected to f4, but now with knight d5 with check, the opponent doesn't have a lot of options. No, so they must move their king, which means that that pawn is lost. So they chose to capture, which is what I expected, but now I capture the c3 pawn, making my b5 pawn a passed pawn. And from this perspective, when I was doing a bit of calculation, I was actually fairly sure that that I should be able to win. That promotion is basically unavoidable. In some lines, sort of I calculate that maybe I would, if the I play, I don't know if this was perfect play, but potentially in some lines I saw that I might be able to promote first, and then in the next turn the opponent promotes. But that I'm not sure whether they were perfect lines. That was the right move. Trying to attack my knight, but knights jump. They move faster than the king, so I move the knight to a4, push forward with f4. Here, my goal is to make sure that the b5 pawn is unassailable. And basically with the king, that should be it. So opponent, thinking that, trying to potentially, block with their king, which I suppose makes sense, but, doesn't work. There is no way that the opponent's king should be able to capture my pawn with the king as defense. So my next goal is to move the knight out of the way to try to whack some of these other pawns, because they still have a pawn majority. So that's 5 versus 3 pawns. So if the opponent potentially plays carefully, they should be able to have a pawn break. So push pawn forward, bring my knight to c3, defended. So basically a direct attack on that e4 pawn. Have to push forward. That's fine. Now I'm in this square, so blocking the advance of the d pawn, and now with an attack on that pawn. That makes sense. And here I've got sort of the advantage of blocking potentially both those squares and also this square. So any advance of the next 3 pawns basically will be captured. Opponent tries to move their king to try to attack my knight, but again, not so easy. So cannot access that square, cannot access that square. So the king is a bit hemmed in. Move my king forward, again, trying to escort the b pawn to promotion. Yep, but that's a straight out capture. I did note that afterwards, that might have been a better move because it allows for allows for, it still covers that pawn, and with the knight there, it still potentially covers these two squares, which is the potential advance of those two pawns. Because, yep, that was the right move, have to capture, so this pawn potentially is now a passed pawn. However, there is no real way that pawn can move forward without being captured by my knight, and these two pawns are fundamentally going to be blocked by my h and g pawn. No, opponent tries to bring the king back into the game. Again, when I have an opportunity, move the king forward to potentially allow for promotion. I suppose reasonable move, but clearly neither of that works. And so now I have basically 4 passed pawns. This opponent pawn on sort of e6 has no chance of getting past my knight. Yep, so promote. And at this point, rather than really trying to think through something clever, trying to promote, trying to prevent loss of any pieces, I decided to play it very, very safe. So queen e3 with check, pretty much forcing the king to capture the knight. And then this allows me to capture pawn. And basically now opponent has no more pawns. And with the king in that position, either of these pawns pretty much must be able to promote. So promote to the d pawn first. Now with that queen, so block off any chance for the opponent king to move out of these two files, and now move my b pawn to promotion, and checkmate. So I was very happy with my performance in this game. No, good game from the opponent. GG. My opponent was positionally ahead, potentially winning after the opening. However, preferencing a very aggressive kingside pawn advance over addressing a hanging knight was a blunder. The opponent was never able to recover from the loss of material, and they simply didn't have sufficient number of attackers on the king side to overwhelm my defense. We entered an endgame where the opponent had a pawn majority, but I had an extra knight, which made all the difference. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.